both chassis side by side so you can see the difference. As you can see, I've removed all the electronics from this one. It all comes out one long strand all together. Pretty easy to do. You have the 2 screws here for your guide. Once you pop the guide blade out, of course. Then this screw here for the polarity switch. And of course you will need a soldering iron to unsolder your connections here. And I'll also remove the RF filters here. You don't really need them, not at all. So we're going to hardwire direct, so not a big deal. So we've got rid of the electronics. Now it's time for the wheels and tires. This is just really simple. If you've never done it before, just a little bit of pressure underneath here, and that'll snap out, and it's out. So same thing with the front, a little bit of pressure below, and they pop right out. So now that we've got this chassis free and clear, we're going to do a little bit of chassis sanding, a little bit of modification here. Like I said, you're going to need a few tools to get started, but there's no better excuse to go buy new tools than tuning a slot car, right? Okay, we're going to get started on the chassis. Okay, we're going to talk about the chassis mods and why we do them. And the reason is there is no body to chassis float, and you want float, especially on a wood track, in stock form. So this chassis, again, is still in stock form. And as you can see, when it's mounted to the body, there's just no movement. And there's a couple reasons for that. So even if you loosen these 4 screws, you're not going to get any float. So the reason for that is twofold. First of all, you'll notice that there is just no clearance here between the body and the chassis. It's a pretty tight, almost a clamshell effect that's holding this the chassis, and there's just no movement at all. The second reason is, we'll take this off, as I tried to highlight and show you, is that here where your mounting screws go through, you'll notice that right here is a raised sleeve, almost a cup design on the chassis, front and back. And what happens is, when you mount the chassis on the body, those sleeves will go over these posts, sleeve themselves over it, and there's just no movement. So what we're going to do is what I like to call radius in the chassis, is we're going to do some sanding with our handy dandy Dremel. So again, if you don't have a Dremel, now's a great time to find that excuse to get probably the world's best slot car tool. Anyway, you'll see here these highlighted edges in the tops of these. So we're going to sand all the way around here, on the sides, a little bit on the front, and then we're going to remove that cup material there, and we're going to make this smooth. We're going to remove those sleeves. Now, one last thing I want to tell you to make this a little bit easier, I can highly suggest using your Dremel, removing this post melt material right here where they've mounted the exhaust. Remove that, and then you can turn it over and pop the exhaust out. Now, when we sand away this material, you're going to get close to one of these outer holes, but that's okay. You really only need one and some glue to mount these back in place. But removing this makes sanding this edge a lot easier. A lot of times people will just end up chewing those exhausts up, and it doesn't look good. So anyway, that's what we're going to do, and that's why we're doing it. So let's get this thing sanded up and see what kind of float we can get. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about removing the material, the edges of these cups right here, these sleeves that we discussed. And you could use a Dremel, a power tool, but I have to tell you, it's real easy to go too far, and then you got problems. My method is good old-fashioned X-Acto blade. So this side's already been done, but what I use is I just a light technique here, where I just go across the top, removing that material like that, just like that, slowly in sections, going all the way around. And then you can get it pretty flush. You can tell when the cut material stops and the chassis starts. And then what you can do is get your good old-fashioned flat file, and then you can file the top until it is flush. So hopefully that'll help you there. Like I said, using a Dremel, it's one of my favorite tools, but sometimes, well, a little lighter touch is needed. But you can do it any way you want. You can even start with a flat file and just start going. It's just a lot of material, so it takes a while, and that's just a method that I choose. Okay, now we're going to get the rest of the chassis, and we're going to give it a test fit. Okay, I'm finished sanding radius in the chassis. Now I did start with my Dremel just to get started, to remove most of the material. But then when you get really close, and you don't want to remove too much material, if you're not good with your Dremel, that's where your good old X-Acto blade comes in handy. You can just take your blade and you can just drag it across the material nice and carefully, and you're only removing little bits of it right there, just pieces at a time. I kind of call that micro adjustment, so that helps there. So sometimes your Dremel is just too much, but anyway, we've got the chassis where we want it now, or at least I feel it is. And as you go, you always test fit, so that's what we're going to do. We'll take this and we'll drop it on the body, and now you can see we have movement. So now when you loosen up the screws, you're actually going to get some float here. So speaking of that, we're going to go over a couple of more small things, and that'll finish this off, and we can get started on the modifications of the guide and wheels and tires. And one more quick note, you notice these little posts coming up from the interior tray. They just rest on the outer portions of the chassis, and they're really not needed. Sometimes they resonate sound, rattle from the chassis, so it makes it louder than it needs to be, and it just doesn't serve much of a purpose. So you go ahead, trim those off. Your chassis is still going to mount just fine, not going to have any problems. And in the future, we're not covering it now, but if you want to lower the car, they're going to have to go anyway. So all my cars, I just take my Dremel with a cutting disc and just take them off. Okay, I've mounted the chassis to the body, have the screws in place, and as you can see, got some really good float. Little lateral movement there, nice and clean, there's no binding, everything's looking good. One of the final things you want to do is when you're putting these screws in and out of this chassis and you're test fitting over time, you can wear those little post threads out, and you're going to want to back these screws off to loosen them, and you don't want them to come off on the track. That's a bad thing. So put a little piece of tape over the hole there. I just use Gorilla Tape, but you can use duct tape, any tape you want. And it's just easy, and that way you don't get a screw falling out and going into the slot, because that's just not pretty. You don't want that. So anyway, here we go. We're all done now. So we're going to work on the guide and the wheels and tires next, but I hope that helps you guys get a little bit of float in your Carrera NASCAR.